What if everything you thought you knew about that Montecito mansion was wrong? Not slightly wrong, not exaggerated, but fundamentally untrue. What if the home that symbolized Meghan Markle's escape, independence, and reinvention wasn't really hers at all? And what if the person who noticed first wasn't a journalist, a royal insider, or a gossip columnist, but Kim Kardashian? Sit with that for a moment. Because this story isn't just about a house. It's about image, power, silence, and what happens when one woman built an empire on radical visibility and another built a narrative on selective mystery. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And then those two worlds quietly collided. Let me ask you something. How long can a carefully curated illusion survive when it's placed under the cold, unblinking light of Hollywood reality? Because for years, that Montecito mansion stood as more than just a property. It was a symbol, a backdrop, a promise, a statement that said, we made it on our own. No palace, no crown, no royal safety net, just sunshine, palm trees, and freedom. At least, that's what we were meant to believe. But here's the uncomfortable question no one wanted to ask out loud. What if the house was never really theirs? What if it was borrowed? And what if someone with far too much experience spotting fake narratives saw the cracks almost immediately? Kim Kardashian didn't rise to the top by missing details. She built her power by understanding perception better than almost anyone alive. She knows what ownership looks like. She knows what borrowed luxury smells like. And she knows the difference between privacy and performance. And according to whispers that have grown louder over time, Kim noticed something that didn't sit right. Something off. Something that didn't match the story. But before we go there, we need to rewind. Back to the moment Montecito became the center of a carefully constructed fairy tale. When Meghan and Harry left the royal family, the world expected chaos, scandal, financial collapse, maybe even regret. Instead, what we got was something very different. A serene coastal escape, a sprawling estate nestled among celebrities, tech billionaires, and old money privacy. A place that quietly screamed success without ever needing to say the word. Montecito wasn't just chosen. It was curated. Every drone shot, every blurred paparazzi image, every carefully timed mention in interviews. The message was clear. We didn't just survive, we thrived. And the house became the physical proof. But here's where things get interesting. In Hollywood, there's a difference between owning something and being allowed to use it. A big difference. Actors do it all the time. Producers, influencers, even billionaires. They borrow jets. They borrow villas. They borrow lifestyles for optics, branding, or transition periods. It's not scandalous. What is scandalous? Pretending it's yours. Especially when your entire public identity is built around authenticity, truth-telling, and breaking free from hidden systems of power. That's where this story begins to shift. Because as time passed, small inconsistencies began to surface. Very small at first, easy to ignore. Why didn't the renovations match the supposed timeline of ownership? Why did neighbors report unusual patterns of occupancy? Why did staff turnover feel more like a temporary arrangement than a permanent household? And most importantly, why did the mansion behave less like a home and more like a long-term set? Most people shrugged it off. Celebrities are weird. Privacy is expensive. Security changes. No big deal. But Kim Kardashian doesn't shrug off patterns. She studies them. See, Kim's relationship with real estate isn't emotional. It's strategic. Every home she owns is documented, showcased, discussed, and unmistakably hers. Ownership is part of her brand. Transparency is part of her leverage. So when someone else builds an identity around a property without ever fully grounding it in reality, it stands out. And allegedly, it stood out to Kim. Not because she wanted to expose anyone, not because she was jealous, but because something about the narrative felt off-brand for Hollywood's unspoken rules. There's an etiquette among the ultra-famous that no one teaches you explicitly. You can borrow quietly. You can transition discreetly. You can accept help behind the scenes. But you don't build moral authority on top of borrowed ground. And that's where the tension begins. Because Meghan didn't just live in Montecito. She used it as a symbol of self-made freedom, as a backdrop for interviews about truth, as visual evidence that she and Harry had escaped the machine and built something of their own. And if that foundation wasn't fully real, then what does that say about the story built on top of it? Now, here's the part that makes this story truly fascinating. Kim Kardashian didn't call a reporter. She didn't drop a hint on social media. She didn't confront Meghan publicly. She did something far more powerful. She waited. Because in Hollywood, the most devastating exposures aren't loud. They're subtle. They come through contrast, not accusation. And slowly, quietly, that contrast began to form. Kim continued to showcase her properties with almost aggressive transparency. Architectural details, purchase timelines, renovation chaos, ownership proudly, almost defiantly on display. Meanwhile, Meghan's Montecito presence became vague. Fewer shots, less specificity, more language about our space instead of our home. If you're wondering whether that difference matters, ask yourself this. Why does someone who values privacy still need you to believe they own something? Because ownership isn't just about control. It's about credibility. And credibility is currency, especially when your brand depends on being believed. This isn't a story about real estate records or legal paperwork. It's about perception. And who controls it? Kim Kardashian understands that better than most people ever will. She knows when to speak. She knows when silence says more. And she knows that the truth doesn't need to chase attention. It just needs time. And time is exactly what this story had. Years, in fact. Years during which whispers circulated quietly among insiders. Years where Montecito was mentioned less and less directly. Years where the house faded from center stage without explanation. And that's when people started asking the question they should have asked from the beginning. Was the Montecito mansion ever meant to be permanent? Or was it always a borrowed chapter? One that stayed open far longer than intended? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Borrowed luxury comes with borrowed power. As long as the illusion holds, everything works. The branding, the authority, the sympathy, the influence. But once someone notices the seams, once someone with enough credibility quietly refuses to play along, the illusion starts to crack. And according to those watching closely, Kim saw the cracks long before the rest of the world did. She just understood something most people don't. Exposure doesn't have to be explosive to be effective. Sometimes, all it takes is letting reality stand next to the performance and allowing the audience to notice the difference. So the question isn't whether Meghan borrowed the Montecito mansion. The real question is this. What happens when the person who noticed first finally decides the timing is right? Because when Kim Kardashian stops protecting a narrative she didn't create, that's when things get interesting. Did you ever notice how some houses feel alive, while others feel staged? Because the Montecito mansion never quite behaved like a real home. That's the detail most people missed. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start with a question no one asked loudly enough at the time. Why did a couple fleeing global scrutiny choose one of the most visible, symbol-loaded zip codes in America? Montecito isn't just expensive. It's performative wealth. Old money wrapped in privacy theater. Celebrities live there not to be seen, but to be known to be unseen. It's a paradox, visibility through absence. So when Meghan and Harry landed there, the choice felt deliberate, almost cinematic. Sunlight, citrus trees, ocean air, a soft focus escape from palace walls. But here's the contradiction. If you're desperate for privacy, Montecito is a strange flex. Because everyone knows what Montecito means. It's not hiding. It's signaling. And that signal mattered. The moment the mansion was announced, headlines followed like clockwork. Fresh start, new life, independent future. The house wasn't just shelter, it became evidence. Evidence that they were free. Evidence that they were thriving. Evidence that the royal chapter was closed. Except, the details didn't add up. At first, it was subtle. Journalists couldn't quite pin down when the purchase happened. Some reports said one date. Others quietly adjusted it. The price floated. The layout changed depending on the article. Was it 9 bedrooms? 11? Did it include a guest house? A meditation space? Those sound like small discrepancies. They're not. In real estate, especially celebrity real estate, details are currency. They're vetted, repeated, locked in. This one kept shifting. Then came the neighbors. Montecito locals are famously discreet. They don't talk. They don't leak. They don't care who you are. That's part of the deal. But whispers still travel. And a few of those whispers sounded confused. People expected a permanent presence. A settling in. Contractors coming and going. personal touches, long-term staff. Instead, what they saw felt temporary. Security rotated like a short-term assignment. Landscaping remained oddly generic. Renovations that were rumored never fully materialized. Let me ask you something. If you just bought your forever home, your post-royal Declaration of Independence, wouldn't you make it unmistakably yours? Wouldn't you change something? Because this place stayed strangely neutral. Beautiful, yes, but emotionally blank. And then there was the filming. When cameras arrived, whether for interviews, documentaries, or carefully framed moments, the angles were tight, controlled, almost cautious, as if certain areas weren't available. That's not unusual for privacy, but it is unusual when the house itself is part of the story. Compare that to other celebrity homes. When Kim Kardashian films in her spaces, you see the chaos, the renovations, the mess, the personality bleeding into the walls. You know when something is hers because it looks lived in, argued over, redesigned, torn apart, rebuilt. Montecito never quite crossed that line. It looked more like a brochure than a biography. And slowly, quietly, some people in Hollywood began to wonder, was this really ownership? Or was it something else? Here's where we need to talk about a practice no one outside elite circles fully understands. Long-term borrowing. It happens all the time. A wealthy friend owns a property they're not using. A studio executive holds real estate as an asset. A tech investor parks money in homes they visit twice a year. Letting someone live there isn't generosity, it's strategy. You maintain the property. You keep it occupied. You add prestige. Sometimes you help a friend. Sometimes you help yourself. And sometimes you help someone craft a narrative they desperately need. Borrowing for a few months? Normal. Borrowing for a year while transitioning? Still normal. Borrowing for years while presenting it as a personal triumph? That's where things get uncomfortable. Because now it's not about logistics. It's about optics. And Montecito was all optics. Every time the house was mentioned, it was framed as a hard-won reward. Proof that Meghan and Harry had stepped into a self-made future. But no one ever walked viewers through the purchase the way they usually do with celebrity homes. No proud, we fell in love with this place. No renovation journey. No personalization arc. Just existence. And existence isn't proof. Now, here's the moment that changed how some insiders viewed the entire situation. The house stopped being talked about. Not officially. Not announced. It just faded. At first, it was subtle. Interviews referenced our life instead of our home. Filming locations shifted. Outdoor shots replaced interior ones. Montecito became a vibe instead of a place. That's not accidental. That's a narrative adjustment. And narrative adjustments happen when the original story no longer serves you. Ask yourself this. If the house was truly theirs, why retreat from it? Why loosen the attachment? Unless the attachment was never meant to be permanent in the first place. This is where Kim Kardashian's role becomes impossible to ignore. Because while Meghan's Montecito presence softened, Kim's real estate visibility sharpened. More transparency, more detail, more ownership. Almost as if she was saying, without saying anything at all, this is what real ownership looks like. And people noticed. Not consciously at first, but subconsciously. Audiences began to feel the difference. One woman inviting you into her chaos. Another carefully controlling the frame. One building credibility through exposure. Another maintaining authority through distance. Neither approach is wrong. But when one is built on something borrowed, the contrast becomes dangerous. And here's the part that makes this chapter truly unsettling. No one had to accuse Meghan of anything. The story started unraveling on its own. Because borrowed things come with expiration dates. And borrowed silence eventually runs out. Somewhere along the line, someone important stopped protecting the illusion. Not loudly. Not publicly. They just stopped reinforcing it. And in Hollywood, that's often the beginning of the end. So the Montecito myth didn't collapse overnight. It thinned. It faded. It lost gravity. Until one question began circulating behind closed doors. Who actually owned that house? And more importantly, why was that question suddenly being allowed to exist? Because when the wrong person stops keeping a secret, the truth doesn't explode. It leaks. Kim Kardashian doesn't borrow houses. That's not a judgment. It's a fact. In a world where illusion is currency, Kim's power has always come from something surprisingly unglamorous. Receipts, deeds, paper trails. Cameras that stay on long enough for the truth to get messy. And that's why this story couldn't stay quiet forever. Because when you understand how Kim operates, you understand why the Montecito situation would have set off silent alarms almost immediately. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you saw Kim Kardashian casually mention a property without proving it was hers? Exactly. Kim doesn't just own homes. She documents ownership like it's part of the architecture. Every purchase becomes a storyline. Every renovation becomes a saga. Walls torn down. Floors replaced. Design disagreements. Delays. Frustration. Pride. Ownership, for Kim, isn't private. It's performative, but honestly so. And that distinction matters. Because in Hollywood, there are two types of wealth signals. Borrowed signals and anchored signals. Borrowed signals are polished, controlled, risk-free. They don't change much because they're not allowed to. You can't knock down walls in a house that isn't yours. You can't leave fingerprints on something you're only meant to occupy temporarily. Anchored signals, on the other hand, are chaotic. They show evolution, mistakes, regret, reinvestment, permanence. Kim lives in the second category, which is why the Montecito narrative felt thin, not fake, not criminal, just strategically incomplete. And Kim is exceptionally sensitive to incomplete stories. Here's something people often forget about her. Kim Kardashian didn't inherit credibility. She fought for it, scrutinized, mocked, dismissed. She learned very early that if you leave gaps in your story, other people will fill them for you, and they won't be kind. So she overcorrected. She showed everything. Too much, sometimes. But that transparency became her armor. Which brings us to the unspoken Kardashian rule. Never claim what you can't prove. It's not about morality. It's about survival. Because when you build your empire on visibility, the fastest way to lose control is to let someone discover you've been obscuring the truth. So when Meghan's Montecito image started circulating as a symbol of independence, Kim didn't react emotionally. She evaluated it structurally. Does the timeline make sense? Does the behavior match ownership? Does the narrative align with the mechanics? And quietly, the answer kept coming back the same. Not quite. Consider this. When Kim buys a house, it's noisy. Public records surface almost immediately. Architects speak. Designers brag. Contractors complain. It becomes impossible to separate Kim from the property because she embeds herself into it. Montecito never had that. It had distance. And distance can be a red flag. Now, to be clear, Kim didn't immediately assume deception. Borrowing is common, strategic, often invisible. But what raised eyebrows was how heavily the Montecito mansion was leaned on as proof of something larger. This wasn't just a place to live. It was a character in the story. And that's dangerous territory. Because once a property becomes symbolic, it has to withstand scrutiny. And scrutiny was coming. What people don't realize is that Hollywood operates on an informal verification system. Powerful people don't usually confront each other directly. They confirm things sideways. Through assistants. Through casual comments. Through offhand questions that seem innocent but aren't. Kim is a master of this. She asks questions without asking them. She notices what people don't say. She clocks who deflects. And according to insiders, when the topic of Montecito came up in those circles, the answers were careful, non-committal. People spoke around it, which is unusual, because if ownership were straightforward, there'd be nothing to protect. And protection is always a signal. Here's where the contrast sharpened. While Meghan's team emphasized privacy, Kim leaned harder into openness. Architectural features, square footage, renovation delays, even frustrations with living in unfinished spaces. It wasn't accidental. Kim wasn't trying to expose Meghan. She was reinforcing a standard. This is what ownership looks like. And audiences, whether consciously or not, felt the difference. One lifestyle felt anchored. The other felt curated. Now let's talk about something most people don't want to admit. Authenticity isn't about truth. It's about consistency. You can hide things and still feel authentic if the story doesn't wobble. But when the details shift, when the language changes, when the confidence fades, people sense it, even if they can't articulate it. And that's exactly what began happening with Montecito. The house stopped being referenced directly. The pride softened. The certainty blurred. Meanwhile, Kim's real estate presence grew louder, clearer, almost defiantly grounded. And that contrast did something subtle but powerful. It reframed the conversation. Instead of asking, "Why is Kim so open?" people began wondering, "Why is Meghan so vague?" And vagueness is dangerous when your brand is built on clarity and truth-telling. This is where the story takes a sharper turn. Because Kim didn't need to say a word for the implications to spread. Hollywood noticed. Media noticed. Audiences noticed. And once a question enters the collective subconscious, it doesn't go away. It multiplies. Was the house owned? Was it borrowed? If borrowed, who owned it? And why was that part of the story never acknowledged? These questions weren't driven by malice. They were driven by contrast. And contrast is brutal. Here's the irony. Kim Kardashian, often dismissed as superficial, as one of the most concrete public identities in modern celebrity culture. Her assets are tangible. Her wealth is visible. Her ownership is documented. Meghan Markle, who built a narrative around substance and truth, suddenly felt abstract. And abstraction erodes trust. Not overnight, but steadily. Now imagine being Meghan during this shift. You're not being accused. You're not being confronted. No one is calling you out publicly. They're just adjusting how seriously they take the story. That's worse. Because there's nothing to fight. Only something to lose. And this is where Kim's silence becomes important. She didn't expose. She didn't correct. She didn't intervene. She simply refused to validate a narrative that didn't meet her internal standards of credibility. And in Hollywood, validation from someone like Kim is oxygen. Without it, stories suffocate quietly. So the Montecito mansion remained standing. But its symbolic weight began to collapse. It stopped being proof. It became a question mark. And once a symbol becomes uncertain, everything built on it starts to wobble. Because if the house wasn't truly hers, what else might have been overstated? What else might have been framed more strategically than honestly? And most importantly, who was protecting that illusion? And why did that protection suddenly weaken? Because the next chapter of this story isn't about Meghan. It's about the people who made borrowing possible in the first place. And when one of them realized their silence was being mistaken for consent, everything changed. Borrowing is Hollywood's worst-kept secret. But there's a line no one talks about out loud. Borrow quietly. Fine. Transition discreetly. Expected. Accept help while you rebuild. Normal. But borrow something and let the world believe you earned it. That's where alliances crack. Because borrowed luxury isn't just about access. It's about permission. Permission granted by someone powerful enough to stay invisible. And invisibility only works when both sides understand the rules. So let's talk about the part of this story that makes people in Hollywood shift uncomfortably in their seats. The invisible owner. Every borrowed home has one. And they're almost never random. They're not friends you met last year. They're not casual acquaintances. They're people with leverage. People who don't need publicity. People who don't want headlines. People who understand that sometimes the smartest move is letting someone else stand in the spotlight. For a while, in Montecito, that wasn't a casual favor. That property sat in one of the most exclusive enclaves in California. Multi-million-dollar valuation. Tight community. Long-term asset. Nobody hands that over without thinking 10 moves ahead. So when insiders started quietly asking who actually owned the mansion, the answers didn't come easily. Names were floated, but never confirmed. Tech money, entertainment money, old California money. And then something interesting happened. The conversation stopped. Not because the truth was discovered, but because someone signaled it was no longer off limits. And that's when the real tension began. Because the question wasn't just who owned the house. It was why that person let Meghan stay there for so long. Think about it. Borrowing a place for a few months while relocating? That's transitional. Borrowing for years while building a public identity around it? That's strategic. Someone benefited from that arrangement. And it wasn't just Meghan. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because borrowed luxury often functions as social currency. You don't just lend a house, you lend legitimacy. You help someone appear settled, established, independent, successful. And in return, you get proximity, influence, sometimes silence. Hollywood runs on these quiet exchanges. But there's a risk. When the borrower starts to believe the borrowed thing belongs to them, when the narrative drifts from gratitude to entitlement, that's when benefactors get nervous. Because now their asset isn't just being used, it's being redefined. And if that redefinition turns public, they lose control. According to whispers, The Montecito arrangement lasted far longer than originally intended. It was meant to be temporary, transitional, a landing pad, but the story kept growing. Documentaries, interviews, symbolism layered on symbolism. The house stopped being a place to stay. It became proof of moral victory. And that's when the silence from the alleged owner reportedly shifted from indifference to concern. Because there's another unspoken rule in Hollywood. You don't make someone else's generosity look like your achievement. Ever. Especially when that generosity was extended quietly. This is where Kim Kardashian re-enters the picture. Not as the exposer, but as the contrast that made the problem impossible to ignore. Kim never needed a benefactor to validate her independence. Her power comes from ownership that's visible, documented, indisputable. And when someone else began using a borrowed asset to claim the same status, it created friction. Not personal, structural. Kim's entire brand is built on the idea that if something is hers, she shows you. If it's not, she doesn't pretend. So when Montecito was positioned as a hard-earned sanctuary instead of a strategic favor, it wasn't just misleading. It was a breach of etiquette. And etiquette is everything in elite circles. You might be wondering, why didn't the alleged owner step in sooner? Simple. Because exposure would have hurt them too. They weren't interested in drama. They weren't interested in headlines. They certainly weren't interested in being dragged into royal-adjacent chaos. Silence was safer. Until silence became risky. Because once the public narrative hardens, it's almost impossible to correct without looking complicit. And that's the moment people start backing away. Protection doesn't end with a bang. It ends with distance. And distance is exactly what began to happen. Access tightened. Availability shifted. The emotional temperature changed. The house was still there, but the warmth wasn't. You can feel that shift in the way Montecito faded from Meghan's storytelling. Not erased. Not denied. Just minimized. And minimization is a tell. It means something once useful has become inconvenient. Now here's where things get especially telling. If Meghan truly owned that house, there would have been no need to soften the attachment. Ownership empowers you to double down. Instead, the narrative pivoted. Less our home. More our journey. Less physical grounding. More abstract language. That's what happens when a symbol outlives its permission. And insiders noticed. Not journalists. Not gossip blogs. Power players. The same ones who understand borrowing, lending, and the cost of overstaying. Because borrowing isn't just about time. It's about trust. And trust has limits. At some point, someone behind the scenes reportedly asked a simple question. How long is this supposed to go on? That question didn't need an answer to be dangerous. Its existence alone changed the dynamic. Because once that question is asked, the countdown begins. And around that same time, Kim Kardashian's posture subtly shifted. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She just stopped reinforcing a story that no longer aligned with reality. And in Hollywood, when a major figure withdraws validation, others follow. Quietly, cautiously, because no one wants to be the last person pretending. This is the part of the story that makes it bigger than Meghan, because it reveals how fragile celebrity narratives really are. They don't collapse because of scandal. They collapse because of withdrawal. When the people who once made things possible stop making them easy. When borrowed power stops feeling worth the cost. And that's exactly what happened to the Montecito myth. It wasn't exposed. It expired. And when something expires quietly, the cleanup is far messier than if it had exploded. Because now you're left with questions you can't answer publicly. Why did we leave? Why did the imagery change? Why does that chapter feel unresolved? And unresolved chapters invite scrutiny. Which brings us to the moment everything shifted from whisper to awareness. Because the internet did what it always does when elites hesitate. It connected dots. And once those dots aligned, the question of ownership stopped being hypothetical. It became unavoidable. But the real shock wasn't what people discovered. It was who allegedly allowed the truth to surface. Because when the person who once benefited from silence decides they're done protecting the story, the illusion doesn't just crack. It collapses inward. Have you ever watched a story unravel without a single accusation being made? No expose, no leaked documents, no explosive interview, just dots connecting themselves. That's what happened next. Because once the question of ownership escaped elite whispers and entered public curiosity, something irreversible occurred. The narrative stopped being protected. And when protection disappears, truth doesn't rush in. It seeps. Slowly, quietly, relentlessly. This is the moment when the internet, dismissed so often as shallow or reckless, did what it does best. It noticed patterns. People didn't start with accusations. They started with side-by-side comparisons, screenshots, timelines, language shifts, small things. But small things, repeated often enough, become impossible to ignore. Suddenly, old interviews were being replayed with fresh ears. Listen closely to how Meghan spoke about Montecito early on. Confident, anchored, declarative. Now listen to how she referenced it later. Vaguer, softer, almost provisional. Words matter, especially when they change. Viewers noticed that the house stopped being named, that it became where we were instead of where we live. That emotional attachment was replaced with philosophical reflection. That's not how people talk about homes they fought to own. That's how people talk about chapters they've already left emotionally, even if they haven't physically moved yet. And once that realization hit, everything else snapped into focus. Why there were no renovation stories? Why no settling in arc? Why no long-term personalization? Because personalization is an investment, and you don't invest deeply in something you don't control. Now here's where the story turns from suspicion to something far more uncomfortable. People began noticing how quickly the Montecito imagery disappeared once it stopped being useful. Think about it. If the house symbolized freedom, why let it fade? If it represented independence, why detach from it? The answer is simple and devastating. Symbols only work as long as they're believed. And belief was eroding. At the same time, Kim Kardashian's contrast became impossible to ignore. Not intentionally, not aggressively, just consistently. Kim continued showing ownership as process, as labor, as something earned through time, money, and inconvenience. Her homes weren't pristine symbols. They were evolving projects. And that evolution told a story Meghan's didn't. One felt rooted. The other felt staged. Again, no judgment, just perception. And perception is everything. Here's where things get even more interesting. As public curiosity grew, mainstream media didn't jump in immediately. Why? Because this wasn't scandal. It was ambiguity. And ambiguity is harder to monetize. You can't headline maybe, but what media outlets did do was quietly adjust their language. Early articles called the mansion their Montecito home. Later ones said their time in Montecito. That's not accidental. Editors don't change phrasing unless something behind the scenes has shifted. And that shift usually comes from sources. Sources who are suddenly less willing to go on record. Which brings us to the most telling sign of all. The silence. No clarifications. No confirmations. No proud declarations. Just nothing. And silence, in this context, is loud. Because if ownership were straightforward, a simple statement would have ended the conversation. But statements require certainty. And certainty requires control. So instead, the narrative drifted. And drift invites speculation. This is where Kim Kardashian's role becomes quietly pivotal. Not because she exposed anything, but because she refused to participate in the ambiguity. She didn't validate it. She didn't reinforce it. She didn't echo it. In Hollywood, that's a signal. A subtle one, but unmistakable. When someone of Kim's stature doesn't back a story, others take note. They may not speak out, but they adjust. They stop repeating. They stop amplifying. And slowly, the story loses oxygen. This is how reputational power actually works. Not through confrontation, through absence. Now imagine being Meghan at this moment. You're not under attack. You're not being accused. But something is slipping. Your symbols are losing their weight. Your narrative is being treated with caution instead of enthusiasm. And caution is the enemy of influence. Because influence depends on trust. And trust depends on clarity. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all. The Montecito mansion wasn't just a place to live. It was a cornerstone. It anchored the entire post-royal story. Remove it, or even weaken it, and everything else starts to wobble. Suddenly, people aren't just questioning the house. They're questioning the framing, the independence, the self-sufficiency, the timeline. And once that door opens, it doesn't close easily. Because here's the truth most people don't want to admit. Celebrity narratives don't collapse because of lies. They collapse because of overreach. Because someone stays in character too long. Because a borrowed chapter becomes a defining act. And eventually, reality pushes back. Not loudly, but firmly. This is where insiders say the emotional tone shifted dramatically. Where once there was quiet accommodation, there was now discomfort. Where once there was protection, there was neutrality. And neutrality, in Hollywood, is a warning. It means, we're not backing this anymore. And when enough people pull back at once, the structure caves in on itself. No explosion, just erosion. Now ask yourself this. If you were Meghan, what would you do next? Defend the house? Clarify ownership? Double down? Or pivot? The choice was made quietly. The narrative pivoted away from place and toward principle. Less focus on where they lived. More focus on what they believed. Less visual grounding. More abstract messaging. That's a survival move. But survival moves leave evidence. And the evidence was piling up. Which brings us to the moment when all of this crossed an invisible threshold. When speculation became awareness. Not because of a leak, but because of a realization. That the Montecito mansion wasn't the end of the story. It was the test. A test of credibility. A test of restraint. A test of whether borrowed power could be carried indefinitely without consequence. And the test was failing. Because the people who once benefited from silence were no longer willing to pay its price. And when that happens, someone always decides to stop holding the line. But who did it first? And why did that decision send shockwaves through Meghan's carefully rebuilt image? Because the next move didn't come from the media. It came from inside the circle. And what followed would quietly expose more than just a borrowed house. It would expose how fragile the entire illusion really was. The moment someone inside the circle stops holding the line, everything shifts. Not because secrets spill immediately. Not because names are named. But because the energy changes. And energy, in elite spaces, is everything. This is the part of the story that never makes headlines, because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No angry statements. No legal threats. No public falling out. Just a quiet recalibration. The kind that only insiders feel at first. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how quickly doors stop opening once people decide you're complicated? Not controversial. Not toxic. Just complicated. That's what began to happen here. Invitations slowed. Introductions softened. Opportunities came with more conditions. And suddenly, the borrowed silence that once protected the Montecito narrative felt less like a favor and more like a liability. Because someone, quietly, deliberately, stopped correcting assumptions. They didn't deny ownership claims anymore. They didn't redirect conversations. They let people wonder. And wondering is dangerous. This is where the alleged benefactor becomes central to the story. Not as a villain. Not as a puppet master. But as someone who realized too late that their generosity had been folded into someone else's mythology. According to insiders, the original arrangement around Montecito was simple. Temporary use. Discretion. No long-term symbolic claims. It wasn't about charity. It was about alignment. Meghan and Harry needed stability. The owner needed occupancy and discretion. A mutually beneficial moment. But moments aren't meant to become monuments. And that's exactly what happened. As Montecito became more than a stopgap, as it became a symbol of earned independence, the owner's silence started to feel misinterpreted. Silence was being read as endorsement. And endorsement carries risk. Because if the story ever unraveled publicly, silence would look like complicity. That's when distance became necessary. Not dramatic distance. Professional distance. The kind that looks like nothing from the outside, but changes everything behind the scenes. Calls returned slower. Clarifications avoided. Third parties no longer looped in. And crucially, no one corrected the internet when it began connecting dots. That was the shift. Because up until then, speculation had been gently discouraged. After that, it was allowed. This is how reputational shields actually fall. Not by force. By permission. Now, let's talk about Kim Kardashian's position in all of this. Kim didn't know the alleged owner personally, or even need to. What she understood was the ecosystem. She recognized when a narrative stopped being supported. And she understood what that meant. Kim has survived decades in a system that eats people alive the moment their story wobbles. She knows the signs. And when she saw the Montecito story lose institutional reinforcement, she did something very deliberate. She leaned into contrast even harder. Not against Meghan, but against ambiguity. More ownership. More receipts. More transparency. almost like she was drawing a line in the sand between stories built on permission and stories built on proof. And again, this wasn't a call-out. It was a demonstration, one that audiences subconsciously absorbed. This is what real independence looks like. This is what earned stability feels like. And that demonstration landed at exactly the wrong time for Meghan, because the ground beneath her narrative was already softening. Now imagine being inside Meghan's camp during this period. You're not being attacked, but you're being questioned. Not publicly, but subtly. Journalists ask for clarifications instead of quotes. Producers request specifics instead of accepting generalities. Partnerships probe harder. That's exhausting. And it forces a choice. Do you clarify, or do you pivot? Clarifying ownership would have required transparency that might expose the borrowed nature of the arrangement. Pivoting allows you to move forward without revisiting the past. The pivot was chosen, which is why Montecito slowly vanished from the foreground. No goodbye? No explanation. Just a shift. But pivots leave trails. And those trails began to attract attention. Why did the house disappear from the narrative so cleanly? Why was there no nostalgia? Why no reflection? People don't usually abandon symbols that serve them well, unless those symbols now pose a risk. And that realization hit the public consciousness harder than any expose ever could. Because now the story wasn't being driven by rumor. It was being driven by behavior. And behavior doesn't lie. This is when Kim Kardashian's name began surfacing more explicitly in conversations. Not as an accuser, but as a reference point. People started asking questions like, why does Kim show everything she owns? Why does she never claim what isn't hers? Why does her independence feel tangible while Meghan's feels philosophical? Those questions weren't fair, but they were inevitable, and they highlighted a deeper issue. In the modern celebrity economy, authenticity isn't about virtue. It's about verification. Kim's empire is verified. Meghan's post-royal narrative was aspirational. And aspirational stories collapse faster than verified ones when pressure is applied. Now here's the part that changes how you see everything that follows. At some point, insiders say Meghan realized the borrowed chapter had overstayed its welcome, not just with the owner, but with the audience. And that realization triggered a quiet retreat, not just from the house, but from the symbolism attached to it. Montecito wasn't just left physically. It was emotionally disowned. And that's a painful thing to do. Because when you emotionally disown something that once defined you, you leave a void. And voids invite interpretation. Which brings us to the turning point. The moment when speculation hardened into consensus. Not because someone confirmed anything, but because no one denied it anymore. And in the world of power, non-denial is confirmation. The Montecito mansion stopped being defended because defending it no longer served anyone. Not the owner. Not Meghan. Not the ecosystem that once quietly enabled the arrangement. And when support evaporates across all fronts, the truth doesn't need a spokesperson. It speaks for itself. This is when the story stops being about a house. It becomes about credibility. Because if one foundational element of the post-royal narrative was borrowed, what else might have been framed more strategically than honestly? That question lingered, unanswered. And unanswered questions are corrosive. They don't explode. They erode. And erosion is far more damaging in the long run. Because now every future claim is evaluated differently. Not dismissed, but measured. And measurement strips power from mythology. Which brings us to the moment Kim Kardashian allegedly made a final, silent decision. Not to protect, not to expose, but to let the contrast speak fully on its own. And when that happened, the gap between borrowed independence and earned ownership became impossible to ignore. The audience didn't need instructions. They saw it. They felt it. And once they did, the Montecito story was over, whether anyone admitted it or not. But this wasn't the end. Because the collapse of one symbol always triggers scrutiny of the next. And the next chapter of Meghan's narrative was already under a microscope. A microscope sharpened by comparison, by silence, by withdrawal, and by the quiet influence of someone who understands power better than almost anyone alive. It was about whether she could still control the story at all, and that would prove far more difficult than borrowing a house. Control is the most addictive thing in the world. And once you feel it slipping, everything else becomes secondary. This is the phase of the story where the problem stops being Montecito and starts being momentum. Because when one carefully constructed symbol collapses, it doesn't fall alone. It pulls other assumptions down with it. Quietly, relentlessly. This is where Meghan's post-royal narrative entered its most dangerous stage. Not scandal. Scrutiny. Let me ask you something. What's harder to recover from? Being attacked or being reevaluated? Attacks create defenders. Reevaluation creates distance. And distance is fatal to influence. Once the Montecito chapter emotionally closed, something subtle but profound happened. The story stopped feeling grounded. It lost its physical anchor. Place matters. Place gives credibility to reinvention. It says, this is where the new life begins. Without Montecito, the narrative floated. And floating stories invite doubt. Suddenly, every appearance felt less rooted. Every message felt more abstract. Values replaced visuals. Philosophy replaced proof. That shift wasn't accidental. It was strategic. But strategy can feel evasive when audiences sense it's compensating for something missing. This is when people began noticing a pattern across Meghan's public positioning. Less specificity. More generalization. Less, this is what we built. More, this is what we believe. Belief-based storytelling is powerful. Until people start asking where it's coming from. Because beliefs without evidence feel aspirational. And aspirational stories require constant reinforcement. That's exhausting. Now contrast that with Kim Kardashian again, not as a rival, but as a reference. Kim doesn't ask you to believe in her independence. She shows you the infrastructure, the assets, the paperwork, the mess. Her credibility doesn't depend on emotional buy-in. It depends on visibility. And as Meghan leaned further into abstraction, that contrast sharpened into something uncomfortable. Not comparison, calibration. Audiences began recalibrating how much weight to give each woman's narrative. And that recalibration wasn't driven by hatred or loyalty. It was driven by trust. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Once trust becomes conditional, everything changes. You don't stop listening. You don't turn away. You just listen differently. You start noticing phrasing. You question framing. You wonder what's being left out. And that's exactly what happened. Projects that once felt urgent began feeling curated. Statements that once felt brave began feeling rehearsed. Not because they were false, but because the foundation beneath them felt less solid. This is the cost of borrowed symbolism. When the borrowed piece disappears, the rest of the structure has to work harder to stand. And working harder shows. Now, insiders say this was the period when Meghan became deeply aware that something had shifted. Not publicly, privately. She wasn't losing attention. She was losing unquestioned belief. And that's terrifying. Because belief is what allows you to lead narratives instead of chasing them. Without it, you're always responding, always correcting, always reframing. Which brings us to the next pivotal move. Meghan didn't try to reclaim Montecito. She didn't double down. She didn't clarify. Instead, she repositioned. The story pivoted toward legacy, toward impact, toward global concerns, toward themes too big to be pinned to one address. That move makes sense. If place has become risky, elevate the conversation above place. But elevation has a downside. The higher you go, the harder it is to feel real. And reality is what audiences had started craving. This is where Kim Kardashian's influence becomes indirect but undeniable. Kim never repositioned away from tangible proof. Even when she spoke about justice, reform, or growth, she grounded it in action. Meetings, documents, results. She understands something critical. People trust what they can see evolving. And that understanding quietly reshaped how audiences evaluated other public figures. Not just Meghan, but Meghan felt it first. Now here's where the story turns from personal to structural. Because the Montecito situation didn't just affect Meghan's image. It altered how gatekeepers interacted with her. When a narrative feels airtight, gatekeepers amplify it without hesitation. When it feels conditional, they hedge. They add disclaimers. They ask more questions. They soften language. That softening is deadly because it signals uncertainty to everyone else. And once uncertainty becomes contagious, it spreads faster than praise ever could. This is when projects began to feel delayed. Not canceled, just slower. Momentum thinned. And thinning momentum is one of the clearest signs of declining narrative power. Meanwhile, Kim Kardashian's momentum never wavered. Not because she was perfect, but because her story was consistent. Consistency is the currency of longevity, and longevity is the ultimate flex. Here's the irony. Kim never had to say a word about Montecito. She never had to acknowledge Meghan. Her influence came from staying exactly who she's always been. Transparent, strategic, and visibly in control of her assets. That steadiness acted like a measuring stick. And when measured, Meghan's repositioning felt less like evolution and more like avoidance. Again, not because it was wrong, but because of what had been lost. The physical anchor, the proof, the place that once grounded the story. Now imagine being Meghan at this crossroads. You can't go backward without reopening questions. You can't stay still without stagnating. You can only move forward and hope the audience follows. But audiences don't follow uncertainty easily. They follow clarity. And clarity was now in short supply. This is where the psychological toll becomes important. Because maintaining a narrative under suspicion, even subtle suspicion, is draining. Every word feels heavier. Every appearance carries risk. Every silence is scrutinized. And that pressure changes how people show up. You become more controlled, more cautious, less spontaneous. And spontaneity is where authenticity lives. So the very thing that once drew people in, emotional openness, became harder to sustain, which only reinforced the perception shift. This is the feedback loop no celebrity wants to enter. Doubt leads to control. Control leads to distance. Distance leads to more doubt. And once that loop starts, breaking it requires something drastic. A reset, a confession, or a complete reinvention. None of those options are easy. Especially when you're still trying to protect parts of the past. Which brings us to the next escalation. Because as Meghan's narrative became more abstract, the internet didn't move on. It dug deeper. Not aggressively. Methodically. And this time, it wasn't just about the house. It was about patterns. Patterns of borrowing credibility. Patterns of aligning with powerful figures. Patterns of stepping away once alignment became inconvenient. The Montecito story became a lens. A case study. And once a case study forms, it reframes everything that came before and everything that comes after. This is when Kim Kardashian's name began appearing in commentary not as a comparison, but as a contrastive example of how power is sustained. Not inherited, not borrowed, but built visibly over time. And that contrast did something devastating. It removed ambiguity. It made people ask a sharper question. Not did Meghan borrow the house? But why does Meghan's story rely so heavily on symbols she no longer stands in? That's a much harder question to answer. Because it's not about fact. It's about coherence. And coherence is everything in storytelling. Without it, even true things feel unstable. Which brings us to the next turning point. Because at some point, insiders say Meghan realized she wasn't just losing control of one narrative. She was losing control of interpretation itself. And once interpretation escapes your influence, the audience becomes the author. That's dangerous. Because audiences are less forgiving than PR teams. And the audience had started writing a new chapter, one Meghan didn't outline. A chapter about borrowed platforms, borrowed spaces, borrowed legitimacy. Fair or not, that perception was taking shape. And perception, once formed, doesn't need confirmation. It just needs repetition. This is where the stakes escalate. Because the next move wouldn't be subtle. It wouldn't be quiet. It would be decisive. Someone would have to speak, clarify, reframe, or disrupt the story entirely. And according to those watching closely, that moment was approaching fast. Because too many threads were now loose. Too many symbols unresolved. Too many questions unanswered. And when that happens in a narrative built on control, something has to give. But who would move first? Meghan, by confronting the past? Every story has a tipping point. And for Montecito, that tipping point arrived not with a headline, not with an interview, but with perception itself. Because in Hollywood, perception is more dangerous than scandal. Once the public starts noticing patterns, inconsistencies, and contrasts, the truth doesn't have to be confirmed. It only has to feel plausible. And the Montecito mansion had become a test case for exactly that. Think about it. For years, it was framed as a sanctuary. A private escape. A symbol of independence and reinvention. A new life built on distance from royalty, scrutiny, and tradition. But every story needs an anchor. Something the audience can touch, see, or understand is real. And Montecito provided that, until it didn't. As time passed, the house stopped appearing in narratives with the same pride or detail. Interviews no longer referenced it. Filming locations shifted. Social media posts became abstract. Language softened from our home to our life and our space. The physical anchor had faded, and the absence of an anchor creates questions. Questions create scrutiny. Scrutiny demands answers, and answers require control, something that had quietly been eroding. This is where Kim Kardashian's influence, though indirect, became undeniable. Kim doesn't need to confront someone publicly to shift perception. She doesn't need a dramatic call-out. She doesn't need headlines. She simply models a contrasting reality. Her homes are documented, transparent, lived in, and earned. Every detail is proof of ownership, effort, and investment. Her brand thrives on visible credibility. In comparison, the Montecito mansion had drifted into abstraction, beautiful, aspirational, but untethered. The contrast was subtle at first, quiet, insidious, but once noticed, it reframed the conversation. Instead of focusing on Meghan's narrative alone, people began to view it through the lens of verification. Who is what? Who really owns what? Who is accountable? Who is performing? And suddenly, the borrowed narrative was no longer just a background detail. It was a vulnerability. This is where the quiet internal shift reportedly began. The alleged benefactor, the person who allowed Montecito to be used, began reassessing. Not publicly, not aggressively, just strategically. Borrowed assets have limits. Borrowed credibility has limits. And once the borrowed element becomes foundational to someone else's story, those limits shrink dramatically. According to insiders, silence started to feel dangerous. What was once discretion now risked being interpreted as consent, and consent could be leveraged against them. That's when distance replaced protection. Calls returned slowly. Clarifications avoided. Third parties less involved. Subtle but critical recalibration. And with that recalibration, the house's symbolic power weakened. The more the audience noticed, the more the story shifted. And the shift didn't require public exposure. It required only withdrawal. And withdrawal, in Hollywood, is as loud as any headline. Once support evaporates, the illusion of permanence falters. The Montecito mansion stopped being a symbol of independence and quietly became a question mark. Not scandalous, not dramatic, just vulnerable. And vulnerability invites interpretation. The audience, once passive, became active. Analysts, commentators, observers, storytellers. The narrative pivoted, whether Meghan intended it or not. From house to philosophy, from proof to principle, from tangible to aspirational. That pivot was logical, but pivots leave traces. The absence of Montecito in interviews, the shift in language, the careful vagueness about place, the subtle detachment from physical space. All of it formed patterns. Patterns that the public noticed. Patterns that gatekeepers noticed. Patterns that subtly eroded credibility. And at the same time, Kim Kardashian's unyielding transparency provided a mirror. You didn't need Kim to confront anyone publicly. You didn't need her to speak Meghan's name. You didn't need her to even comment on Montecito. The contrast was enough. Ownership you can show versus independence you claim. Anchored versus aspirational. Evidence versus abstraction. And once that contrast is visible, the narrative shifts without a single word of accusation. Now the pressure wasn't from media, social media, or even critics. It was internalized scrutiny. Every move, every word, every post analyzed differently. And when the audience scrutinizes differently, the rules of engagement change. Once scrutiny changes, credibility becomes conditional. Once credibility is conditional, influence diminishes. And once influence diminishes, power becomes precarious. This is the subtle but devastating moment in the Montecito saga. A borrowed mansion, once a symbol of independence, became a vulnerability, and the public's perception began operating independently of the narrative's creator. The story no longer belonged solely to Meghan. It now existed in a shared space of interpretation, comparison, and judgment. And that is when the quiet reckoning began. Because borrowed symbols can sustain a story temporarily. But once they lose their protective layers, the story they support cannot survive unscathed. The moment had arrived when silence no longer protected anyone. Not the mansion, not Meghan, not the invisible benefactor. Because in Hollywood, as in royalty, perception is a living thing. It doesn't wait politely. It grows. It shifts. It punishes in small, relentless ways until someone takes notice. And notice was finally being taken. It started quietly. Subtle comments from insiders. Offhand remarks on social media. Observations from neighbors and acquaintances. The kind of details that are easily dismissed individually, but collectively, impossible to ignore. People started questioning the Montecito mansion in ways that weren't about the luxury.